The year 1720 began with blood already in the water. Off the windward coast of Hispaniola, where the trade winds died in the last hours before dawn and the sea turned to black glass, a three-masted brigantine called La Voz del Diablo drifted without purpose beneath a sky choked with stars. Her sails hung slack, her lanterns burned low, and at her helm stood the man they called El Capitan Rojo, the Red Captain, a figure so feared along the Caribbean trade routes that merchant vessels had been known to run themselves aground rather than face him on open water. His real name was Emilio Castren de Varga, born in Cadiz to a Basque mother and a Flemish naval officer who died drunk in a Seville gutter before the boy turned 9. He had gone to sea at 11, earned his first scar at 15 in a skirmish off the Canary Islands, and by the age of 30 had accumulated enough grievances against the Spanish crown, the English trading companies, and every harbour master between Tortuga and Veracruz to fill 3 volumes of Admiralty proceedings. He wore a long coat of deep crimson wool, Spanish military issue, stripped from a dead commodore in 1714, and it was this coat, perpetually salt-crusted and wind-hardened, that had given him his name. Sailors who saw that red shape moving through cannon smoke said it looked less like a man and more like an open wound walking upright across the deck. If you sail these waters in your imagination, if you hear the creak of rope and the groan of timber in your bones, leave your name below, tell us what country or city you call home, and subscribe, because this story belongs to every port that ever feared the sea. By February of 1720, La Voz del Diablo had spent 4 months raiding the eastern Caribbean with brutal efficiency. 3 English merchant vessels had been taken between Barbados and the Leeward Islands. A Portuguese slaver carrying silver bullion from the Brazilian coast had been stripped to the waterline somewhere south of Puerto Rico, its crew put ashore on a sandbar with a barrel of fresh water and nothing else. A French colonial supply ship bound for Martinique had been boarded at night during a squall. Its cargo of grain, cloth, and salted pork divided among the crew in the hold, while the captain of the French vessel wept openly in his cabin and begged the Virgin for deliverance. Castren de Varga had watched the Frenchman pray with something approaching contempt, not because he lacked faith himself, but because he had long since concluded that God, if he existed at all, had interests that ran parallel to those of the sea rather than to those of men who sailed it. The sea did not answer prayers. It answered weight, angle, wind, and nerve. His crew numbered 41 men at full complement, drawn from 7 nations and bound together, not by patriotism or ideology, but by the simple arithmetic of shared plunder. There were men from Jamaica, from the Dutch colonies of Curaçao, from the Spanish ports of Cartagena and Havana, from the French buccaneer communities of Tortuga, from Portugal, from the English colony of Carolina, and one man, a carpenter named Oswald Tibbs, who claimed to be from a place in the English Midlands so obscure that no one aboard had ever heard of it, and no one believed him anyway. They were not, by any standard that civilization could measure, a brotherhood. They were 41 individuals who had each, for their own private reasons, concluded that the law offered them less than lawlessness, and that La Voz del Diablo was, at least for now, a more reliable shelter than any port in the Atlantic world. The ship itself was a captured prize, a brigantine originally commissioned by a Dutch merchant house in Amsterdam, seized by Castren de Varga in 1716, off the coast of Saint-Domingue, after a 2-day chase that had left the Dutch crew exhausted, and the ship's first mate dead of a musket ball through the shoulder. The Red Captain had kept the hull and the rigging, replaced the Dutch flag with a black cloth bearing no device. He disdained the theatrical skulls and bones that other pirate captains favoured, considering them performances for an audience he had no interest in entertaining, and spent the following years pushing the vessel to the limits of what its frame and its crew could endure. The ship could sail. More importantly, the ship could run. She sat low in the water and carried enough canvas to catch wind that heavier vessels could not reach. In favorable conditions, she could outpace anything the Spanish coastal patrols put to sea, and in unfavorable conditions, she could navigate inshore waters that frigates could not follow without grounding themselves on coral. This was the essential advantage that kept La Voz del Diablo alive in an ocean increasingly crowded with naval authority and colonial ambition. But by February of 1720, the ocean was changing. The Treaty of Madrid in 1670 had drawn lines across the Caribbean that neither pirates nor colonists had ever fully respected. But in the years that followed, the War of Spanish Succession ended in 1713. The European powers had begun, with renewed seriousness, to enforce those lines. England had issued the Act of Grace in 1717, offering pardons to pirates who surrendered, and then had dispatched Woodes Rogers to Nassau in 1718 to make clear what happened to those who refused. Rogers had hanged men in Nassau harbour within sight of their former companions. The message had been understood. The golden age of piracy was not over. It would not be over until men like Bartholomew Roberts and Edward Lowe had run their courses. But it was narrowing, contracting, growing more dangerous at every edge. Castren de Varga had refused the pardon. He had not refused it out of ideology or romanticism. He had refused it because he had, in the years between 1714 and 1718, accumulated a list of crimes against the Spanish crown long enough that no English pardon could protect him in Spanish waters. And the Spanish waters were, for a man of his particular roots and habits, inescapable. There was also the matter of a French naval officer named Beaumont, killed in 1716 during the seizure of a ship near Martinique, whose death had created complications with the French colonial administration that a simple pardon document could not resolve. Castren de Varga was, in the precise maritime legal sense of the era, a man without a safe harbour in the known world. This was, for most of the crew of La Voz del Diablo, an inconvenience they had chosen with open eyes. For some of them, by early 1720, it had become something more urgent. The trouble had begun with the Portuguese silver. When the slaver had been taken south of Puerto Rico in January, the cargo hold had contained not merely the modest commercial goods listed on the vessel's papers, but something considerably more significant. A sealed iron chest, bolted to the floor of the captain's cabin and wrapped in oilcloth, containing approximately 4,000 pieces of 8 in Spanish colonial silver, along with a smaller pouch of uncut emeralds from the Colombian mines near Muzo. The emeralds alone were worth more than the combined haul of La Voz del Diablo's previous 6 months of raiding. Castren de Varga had taken possession of the chest personally. He had not opened it in front of the crew. He had carried it below to his own cabin, locked the door, and emerged 3 hours later with the pouch of emeralds hanging from his belt and the iron chest presumably stowed somewhere in the private spaces that no member of the crew entered without permission. This was the first deviation from the articles. Every man aboard La Voz del Diablo had signed, or marked if they could not write, a set of articles when they joined the crew. These articles were not unusual by the standards of the era. They specified the shares of plunder. The captain received 2 shares, the quartermaster 1.5, skilled men such as the carpenter and the surgeon received 1 1/4, common sailors received 1, and boys received half. All prizes were to be counted and distributed openly in the presence of the quartermaster within 24 hours of their taking. No man could claim private possession of shared plunder. The articles were, in practice, the only law that existed aboard La Voz del Diablo. Castren de Varga had written those articles himself. His failure to open the iron chest in the presence of the quartermaster, a lean and watchful Jamaican named Samuel Ibarra, who had been with the Red Captain since 1715 and whose arithmetic was trusted absolutely by the entire crew, was noticed within hours. By the following morning, it was the only thing anyone on the ship was talking about. By the third day, Ibarra had presented himself at the captain's cabin door and requested, formally and by article, an accounting of the Portuguese cargo. Castren de Varga had told him to come back tomorrow. Tomorrow arrived. Ibarra came back. The door remained closed. The captain's voice from behind it said that the chest contained documents of a sensitive nature that required careful examination before distribution, and that the crew would receive their shares in due course. The word documents passed through the crew like a lit fuse through dry powder. No one believed in the documents. It was Tibbs, the carpenter, who first said aloud what others were thinking in whispers. He said it in the ship's hold, in the hour after the night watch changed, when the only light came from a single lantern swinging on a hook above the water barrels, and the only sounds were the creak of the hull and the slow breathing of sleeping men. He said it quietly, but in the particular acoustics of a wooden ship at night, quiet carried farther than intended. He said that the captain meant to keep the silver for himself. He said that the emeralds, visible on the captain's person, worn openly on his belt as though daring anyone to comment, were proof enough of what had already been taken from the common share, and that a man who would take emeralds would take silver, and that a man who would take silver in violation of the articles had already, in the only moral sense that mattered on these waters, ceased to be a captain and become a thief. The word thief landed in the hold like an anchor. Among men who had chosen to live outside the law, theft was not merely a crime. It was a category of betrayal that touched the foundations of everything that made collective survival possible. A pirate crew could tolerate cruelty, incompetence, bad luck, storms, hunger, and defeat. What it could not tolerate, what no articles of any ship in the Atlantic world permitted, was a captain who stole from his own men. That was the one transgression that dissolved the authority of command absolutely and immediately and without appeal. Ibarra listened to Tibbs speak and said nothing, but in the morning he requested an audience with the captain again, and this time he brought with him 3 other men. A broad-shouldered Curaçaoan named Hendrik, who served as the ship's boatswain, a former Spanish naval gunner called Delgado, who had joined the crew after deserting in Havana in 1717, and a young sailor from Carolina named James Wren, barely 20 years old, who had been on the ship only 8 months, but who was already known for a particular quality of silence that men tended to listen to. The 4 of them stood at the cabin door. This time, Castren de Varga opened it. He was wearing the red coat. He was always wearing the red coat. His hair was tied back with a strip of leather, and his face was weathered to the texture of old sail canvas, creased and brown, with eyes that were neither warm nor cold but simply very precise, the eyes of a man who had spent 20 years calculating distances and angles and the intentions of other human beings. He looked at the 4 men in the corridor, and he did not appear surprised. He appeared to have been expecting them. He told them that the chest had been opened. He told them that it contained, as he had said, documents, specifically letters of introduction from a Portuguese merchant in Recife to a factor in Havana, along with a private correspondence that was none of their concern, and a smaller quantity of silver than rumour had suggested. He said the silver had been counted. He said the shares were being calculated. He said Ibarra would receive the accounting within the day. Ibarra said he would prefer to see the chest. There was a silence. In that silence, something shifted. Some atmospheric pressure in the narrow corridor of the ship. Some subtle alteration in the angle of the lantern light. Some almost imperceptible change in the way Castren de Varga's right hand moved toward the coat's interior. Ibarra saw it. Hendrik saw it. Delgado, who had spent 8 years in the Spanish Navy learning to read the moment before violence, saw it most clearly of all. It was Wren, the youngest, who moved first, not toward the captain, but sideways, pressing himself against the corridor wall as though instinctively making space for something that had not yet happened. Castren de Varga looked at Wren. He looked at Ibarra. He looked at the chest, which was visible through the open cabin door, sitting on the floor beside the captain's chart table, its iron lock gleaming dully in the lamplight. He said, "Very well." What happened in the cabin in the next several minutes would be described differently by each of the surviving witnesses, and the differences in those descriptions would matter enormously in the months that followed. What they agreed upon was this: the chest was opened, the silver was present, not 4,000 pieces of 8, but approximately 2,800, a discrepancy of more than 1,000 coins that could not be explained by any arithmetic of documents or cargo assessments. The emeralds were not in the chest. Castren de Varga said the emeralds had been his private salvage from a secondary container, not part of the shared prize. Ibarra said the articles made no provision for secondary containers. Delgado said that a man who cited provisions of the articles while violating their substance was a man who had already decided what the outcome of this conversation would be. The captain drew his pistol. He drew it the way men drew pistols in small spaces, not with theatrical deliberation, but with the compact, decisive motion of someone who had made a calculation and arrived at its conclusion before the conversation began. The pistol was a flintlock, French-made, with a barrel that had been cut short for ease of concealment and a grip worn smooth by years of handling. Castren de Varga was an excellent shot. Everyone on the ship knew he was an excellent shot. This was not a secret, and it was not irrelevant. Ibarra died in the cabin doorway. He died quickly, which was something, and he died without having said anything further, which was something else. A silence that Wren, standing against the corridor wall, would carry with him for the rest of his life. Castren de Varga reloaded the pistol. He came out of the cabin. He walked the length of the ship. What happened in the following 2 hours aboard La Voz del Diablo is partially documented in the single written account that survives from that night. A water-damaged journal kept by a sailor named Pedro Vargas Soto, no relation to the captain, who was on the night watch at the stern and who recorded what he heard and saw in a cramped, frightened handwriting that deteriorates visibly as the pages continue. The account describes gunfire from below deck. It describes screaming that stopped. It describes a series of splashes, 4, possibly 5, that the writer interpreted as bodies being put over the side. It describes the Red Captain appearing on deck sometime in the middle hours of the night, standing at the rail in the lantern light, with the red coat dark and wet across the chest and shoulders, looking out at the black water for a long time without moving. It does not describe what happened after that. The journal ends there. The page is torn. By the account of the harbour master at Port Royal, Jamaica, recorded in a colonial administrative document dated March 14, 1720, and preserved in the Spanish Colonial Archive in Seville, La Voz del Diablo was sighted off the eastern approach to Port Royal on the morning of March 9th. She was recognized by her silhouette and her lack of colors. The harbour guard vessel went out to intercept her and found the brigantine drifting, sails poorly trimmed, making about 2 knots on a wind that should have given her 6. When the guard vessel came alongside and hailed her, no one answered. The boarding party found 7 men alive. 7 men, out of a crew that had numbered 41 when the ship left its last known position south of Puerto Rico in January. The 7 survivors were in poor condition. 3 were injured. Sword cuts, 1 musket wound to the thigh that had been crudely dressed with cloth torn from a hammock. All 7 were malnourished and severely dehydrated, consistent with having been rationed to emergency supplies for an extended period. None of them were officers. None of them were men who had been present in the corridor outside the captain's cabin on the night of the first confrontation. They were taken ashore at Port Royal and questioned by the colonial authorities. Their accounts, delivered separately and recorded by a clerk of the Admiralty Court, agreed on the broad outline of events: the confrontation over the Portuguese silver, the death of Ibarra, a period of violence aboard ship during which the captain had, as they collectively described it, gone against the crew. A phrase that meant, in the vernacular of the era, something more specific and more terrible than its literal components suggested. It meant that the captain had turned the ship into a place where ordinary survival required the death of other men. When the authorities asked about the captain himself, all 7 survivors gave the same answer: they did not know. They had last seen Castren de Varga on the morning of March 2nd, standing at the bow of the ship in the red coat, looking north toward the Cuban coast. When they came on deck an hour later, he was gone. The longboat was still aboard. The ship's small jolly boat, which hung at the stern, was also still in place. There was no indication of how a man might have left the ship. There was simply an absence where the captain had been, and the ship drifting on the current, and the 7 surviving men trying to make enough sail to reach a port before the water ran out. The iron chest was found in the captain's cabin, open and empty. The red coat was not found anywhere on the ship. The Colonial Admiralty Court at Port Royal conducted a formal inquiry in April of 1720. The 7 survivors testified. The harbour master's report was entered into the record. The clerk who had taken the survivors' depositions was questioned about inconsistencies. A representative of the Spanish crown presented documentation of the crimes attributed to Castren de Varga, including the seizure of the Portuguese slaver and its silver cargo, and formally requested that any prisoner answering to his description be extradited to Havana for trial. The inquiry concluded with a finding that La Voz del Diablo had been the site of a criminal mutiny, that the crew's actions in defending the articles of their own accord were consistent with the practices of disorganized criminal vessels, and that the disposition of the captain and the primary cargo remained unknown. The 7 survivors were held for several months before being released without charge, a decision that reflected the practical reality that colonial authorities had more pressing concerns in 1720 than the prosecution of 7 near-dead sailors from a ship that had already destroyed itself. The brigantine itself was condemned, stripped of useful materials, and broken up in the Port Royal harbour over the course of a summer week. The iron chest was retained as evidence and then appears to have disappeared from the Admiralty record sometime in the following year, a disappearance that a meticulous Spanish archivist in the 19th century would annotate in the margin of the original document with a single dry word: inevitable. The story of the Red Captain did not end with the inquiry. Stories like his never ended with inquiries. In the taverns of Port Royal and Tortuga and the buccaneers' anchorages along the north coast of Cuba, the tales circulated and mutated over the following years with the organic energy of a thing that had touched something true about the world. In some versions, Castren de Varga had swum ashore on the Cuban coast with the emeralds in a sealed pouch and was living under a false name somewhere in Havana or Santiago, unremarkably wealthy, growing old. In others, he had been taken by a Spanish patrol vessel before he could reach the coast and hanged in Havana under a name no one in the Caribbean would have recognized. In still others, the versions told late at night by men who had been at sea long enough to believe in things that daylight made implausible, he had not left the ship at all, had simply stepped off the bow into the deep water that morning in March 1720. The red coat pulling him down, the silver already distributed among whatever currents ran beneath the Windward Passage, a man who had chosen the sea over the accounting that was coming for him. Pedro Vargas Soto, the sailor who had kept the journal, eventually made his way to the Spanish colony of Cartagena de Indias, where he lived until at least 1731, working as a harbour pilot. He never published the journal and apparently showed it to very few people. After his death, his possessions were inventoried by a Cartagena notary, and the inventory includes a reference to un libro de bitácora dañado por agua, a water-damaged logbook, among his effects. There is no record of what happened to it after the inventory was filed. James Wren, the young sailor from Carolina who had pressed himself against the corridor wall on the night Ibarra died, returned to the English colonies sometime in 1721. He settled eventually in Charlestown, South Carolina, where he worked as a chandler's assistant and reportedly never spoke of his time at sea to anyone. He married in 1724 and had 3 children. He died in 1763 at the age of 63, having outlived the golden age of piracy by 4 decades and carrying in his body and his silence the full weight of a night he had not written down and would not describe. What the sea took, the sea kept. Off the northern coast of Hispaniola, in the deep water east of the Windward Passage, where the trade winds pick up in the late afternoon and push long swells westward toward Cuba, fishermen in the early years of the 18th century occasionally reported seeing, at low tide on clear days, a shape on the sea floor in the shallows of a particular reef. Something long and dark, they said, like a coat spread wide against the sand, rippling at the edges in the current, as though the body inside it had simply decided to rest there and let the ocean pass over it. None of them dived down to look. They knew better than to disturb whatever the sea had already claimed. On the floor of the Windward Passage, in water too deep for any diver of that era to reach, the iron chest would have rusted to nothing within a generation. Hinges, lock, bolts, all dissolved by the salt that dissolved everything eventually, leaving only the dark impression of its shape pressed into the sediment. And then not even that, as the currents rearranged the fine particles of the ocean floor in patterns that answered to no human design and kept no human record. The red coat was never found.